Linda's just the maid around here, Carlos announced to our 25th anniversary party guests, raising his beer bottle like he was making a toast. The words hit me like ice water, even though the Georgia heat had left me exhausted from hours of cooking and preparing for tonight. I stood frozen in my own kitchen doorway, holding a tray of appetizers I'd been arranging since 3 o'clock. My arthritis was flaring badly. The humid weather always made it worse, and my hands were already aching from all the preparation. Now they started trembling for an entirely different reason. Our friends Bob and Sarah Martinez looked uncomfortable, their smiles faltering as they glanced between Carlos and me. But my husband wasn't finished. She doesn't understand important things like property values or financial planning, he continued, taking another swig of beer. That's why I handle all the real decisions about our house and money. 25 years of marriage, and he was talking about me like I was hired help, in front of people who'd watched me sacrifice my own career dreams to support his 3 failed business ventures. People who knew I'd worked double shifts as a bookkeeper while he chased his latest passion project. Linda's good with the domestic stuff. Cooking, cleaning, organizing papers, Carlos said, waving his hand dismissively. But the important financial decisions, that's man's work. I could feel heat rising in my chest, mixing rage with the physical pain already coursing through my joints. Sarah Martinez looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her husband Bob was studying his shoes with sudden fascination. Then Carlos dropped the announcement that would change everything. Actually, I'd been meaning to tell everyone, this house is worth about $850,000 now. I'm putting it on the market Monday. He said it like he was discussing the weather, casual and confident. Already talked to a realtor this morning. My breath caught in my throat. He was planning to sell my house without asking, without even mentioning it to me first. Linda will adjust to whatever I decide, he continued, not even looking in my direction. She's never had to worry about these kinds of complicated decisions before. What Carlos didn't know, what he'd never bothered to ask about in 25 years of marriage, was whose name was actually on the deed to that $850,000 house. What he'd never seen were the documents sitting in my organized filing cabinet. The same filing cabinet he'd dismissed for decades as Linda's little paperwork hobby. What he'd completely forgotten were the papers he'd been signing every month for 25 years. Papers he assumed were mortgage payments, but told a very different story about who owned what in this marriage. I walked to the kitchen counter and set down the appetizer tray. My hands steadier now, despite the arthritis pain. For the first time in months, I felt completely calm. In my filing cabinet upstairs sat 25 years of proof that Carlos had been living in my house, paying me rent, while assuming he owned everything important in our lives. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Smart women keep some things private, Linda, just in case. Tomorrow, Carlos would discover exactly what happens when a man tries to sell his landlord's house. Tonight, I would let him enjoy his last few hours of certainty about who controlled what in this marriage. After all, the papers he'd never bothered to read were about to tell him the truth he'd been too arrogant to learn. The next morning, Carlos was on the phone in the kitchen when I came downstairs. My arthritis worse after yesterday's stress. No, Sophia, you don't understand, he was saying. Linda's never been involved in real financial decisions. She just handles household stuff. Sophia, his administrative assistant who'd been calling at odd hours for months. I stayed quiet by the doorway, listening as he discussed my life like I was some obstacle to manage. She has no idea what this property is worth, Carlos continued smugly. 25 years, and she's never asked to see the deed or mortgage papers. She trusts me to handle everything important. My hands clenched, sending pain through my joints. He was talking about documents upstairs in my filing cabinet, documents he dismissed as women's paperwork for decades. The realtor thinks we can move fast. Linda will go along with whatever I decide. She always does. I made coffee quietly, my mind racing. Carlos had never once asked to see actual ownership papers. He'd simply assumed that writing checks meant he owned everything. Can you meet me this afternoon? I want to show you the house before we list it. My mug nearly slipped. He was bringing his affair partner to help him sell my house. Linda will be out running errands. Perfect timing to walk through without complications. Complications. 25 years of marriage reduced to complications. I climbed upstairs, each step deliberate despite knee pain. In our closet, Carlos's suitcase sat partially packed, hidden behind winter coats. He'd been planning this for months. I opened my filing cabinet, the one he'd mocked as obsessive organization, and pulled out the folder marked property documents. Inside was the deed from 1998, when my grandmother died and left me this house. 6 months before Carlos and I married. My name, only my name, just like grandmother insisted. Men assume they own whatever they can see, she'd warned me. Smart women make sure the law says different. I'd never told Carlos about the inheritance. He'd moved in after our wedding, started writing checks for mortgage payments, and I'd deposited them. Easier to let him believe what he wanted. But those monthly checks? They weren't mortgage payments. There had never been a mortgage. For 25 years, Carlos had been paying me rent while thinking he owned my house. I photographed every document, the deed, property tax records, insurance policies, all showing my name as sole owner. Then I pulled out another folder that would matter more. 25 years of Carlos's canceled checks, each memo line reading rent in my handwriting. I scrolled through weeks of screenshots, Carlos's texts with Sophia about their future, voice recordings of calls about plans after breaking free, evidence he'd been too arrogant to hide. At 2 o'clock, I heard Carlos's car, then another engine. Through the window, I watched him open the passenger door for a blonde woman from his office. Sophia stepped out, examining my landscaping like she already lived here. They had no idea the woman they planned to defraud was upstairs with 25 years of legal proof that Carlos was just a tenant. My phone buzzed, text from attorney Margaret Flynn confirming our 3 o'clock appointment. I gathered documents and headed for the back door, leaving Carlos and Sophia to tour the house they thought they were stealing. By the time they discovered who really owned what, it would be too late to change course. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Smart women keep some things private just in case. Today, Carlos would learn exactly what happens when assumptions meet legal reality. At Margaret Flynn's law office, she examined my documents with attention Carlos had never given anything I considered important. Mrs. Rodriguez, this is ironclad. You're the sole owner. He's meeting a realtor at 2 o'clock to list my house with his girlfriend. That's attempted fraud. We need to document this. I showed her Carlos's texts promising Sophia their house, voice recordings dismissing my intelligence while planning to steal my property. Remarkable documentation. What's your goal? I want him to face the truth he's been too arrogant to see. At 1:50, I parked across from my house, watching Carlos pace on my porch. A silver sedan arrived, Janet Morrison from Premier Realty. I waited until they were settled before walking through my door. Excellent property, Carlos was saying confidently. I've owned it 25 years, maintained it perfectly. Sophia sat on my couch like she belonged there. Mr. Rodriguez, Janet said, I'll need to verify the deed before listing. Of course. Linda handles paperwork filing, but I can get whatever you need. I cleared my throat from the doorway. Actually, I have those documents. Carlos's confidence faltered as I entered carrying a thick folder. Mrs. Rodriguez, your husband was explaining the listing details. How interesting. Carlos, did you tell Janet who actually owns this house? We own it together. Don't confuse things with technicalities. I handed Janet the deed. The technicality is my name's the only one on ownership documents. Janet's eyes widened. This shows sole ownership by Linda Rodriguez. Your name isn't here. Carlos flushed. That's wrong. I've paid the mortgage 25 years. There is no mortgage, I said, pulling out another folder. Carlos, remember what you've been signing monthly for 25 years. Mortgage papers, obviously. I spread rental agreements across my coffee table, each marked rental agreement, each signed by Carlos Rodriguez in bold, confident handwriting. These are rental agreements. You've been my tenant 25 years. Deafening silence. Janet studied documents with professional fascination. Mr. Rodriguez, These are clearly rental agreements, your signatures on every one. Carlos grabbed the most recent agreement from 3 months ago. In his handwriting, the memo read, "Another year and my house. Nell doesn't understand property values." His face went white, reading his own words. "You wrote that memo on a rental agreement, while claiming the house was yours." Sophia stared at Carlos like she'd never seen him. "You've been renting this entire time?" I assumed." "You assumed," I agreed. 25 years assuming being a man who wrote checks meant owning everything important. Never asked to see the deed. Never read what you signed. Janet photographed documents. "I'm withdrawing from this listing. You can't sell property you don't own." Carlos's hands shook. "We're married. Partners." Partners read documents before signing. Partners don't call wives the maid. Partners don't plan selling their spouse's house with girlfriends. Sophia stood abruptly. "You told me you owned this house outright, promised we'd live here together." "I thought I did." "You thought? You've lived in fantasy 25 years?" I played a recording. "Linda's so trusting. Never questions anything. No idea what this property's worth." Silence again. "Actually, I've always known exactly what my property's worth." "Never corrected your assumptions." Carlos slumped forward as 25 years of delusion collapsed. Janet packed efficiently. "Mrs. Rodriguez, if you ever sell, call me direct." Sophia gathered her purse. "Don't contact me again. I can't be with someone living in complete denial." After they left, Carlos sat alone, surrounded by evidence of his arrogance. "How long have you been planning this?" "I've been documenting your behavior. Planning started when you called me the maid. What happens now? Now you face truth you've avoided 25 years. You're my tenant, Carlos. Always have been." After Margaret left and Sophia fled, Carlos sat staring at documents scattered across my coffee table like they were written in a foreign language. 25 years of rental agreements, 25 years of canceled checks made out to me, 25 years of proof that the confident husband he'd believed himself to be had actually been my tenant. "This has to be a mistake," he said hollowly. "I've been making house payments since we married." "Rent payments," I agreed, settling into my grandmother's armchair. "Very reliable ones. I've always appreciated that about you as a tenant." My arthritis was still bothering me, but the pain felt manageable. Amazing what clarity could do for stress. Carlos picked up a rental agreement from 15 years ago. His signature was bold at the bottom, below the clause stating he was renting from Linda Rodriguez. "I never read these," he admitted. "I know. You always said paperwork was boring, that you trusted me with details while you focused on important things." He looked up with something like recognition. "You knew. All these years, you knew I thought I owned this house. You never asked. In 25 years, Carlos, you never once asked to see the deed. You assumed that being the man, writing checks, meant you owned everything important." My phone buzzed. I glanced and smiled. "Problem?" Carlos asked. "Sophia's asking if I knew about your joint bank account. She just discovered the money you promised her doesn't exist." Carlos went pale. "What joint bank account?" "The one you opened with her last month, where you've been depositing money from our account. Money that's frozen pending divorce proceedings." "Divorce?" Carlos stood so quickly he knocked over his beer, liquid spreading across my grandmother's table. "We can work this out." I handed him a towel, watching him frantically clean up. Probably the first time in years I'd seen him actually clean anything. Work what out? Calling me the maid? Planning to sell my house? Having an affair while telling me money was tight? Carlos sat heavily. "How long have you known?" "About Sophia?" 3 months. "The money transfers?" 4 months. "Your ignorance about house ownership?" 25 years. "Why didn't you say anything?" I studied this man I'd married for half my adult life. When had he become someone who could dismiss me so casually? When had I become invisible? I kept hoping you'd remember I wasn't actually stupid, that eventually you'd ask to see important papers, wonder why we never dealt with a mortgage company, notice property tax bills addressed to me. I was protecting you from complicated financial stuff. You were protecting yourself from acknowledging your wife might know things you didn't. My phone rang, Margaret, with updates. The real estate listing has been blocked. Your husband's contract promising quick sale has been canceled. Also, the joint account is frozen. He'll have his personal account for expenses, but no major financial moves until divorce finalization. Carlos heard everything. His shoulders sagged as another piece of his plan crumbled. You've been planning this for months, he said. I've been documenting your behavior. Planning started when you called me the maid. What happens now? Now you pack and find somewhere else to live. 30 days, standard tenant notice. Where am I supposed to go? You have your personal account, the one you've been funding while telling me we were broke. That should cover moving expenses. Carlos looked at me with something between respect and fear. I never realized you were so calculating. I prefer thorough, a skill from 25 years managing details you couldn't be bothered with. He stood slowly, gathering scattered documents like evidence of an unknowing crime. 25 years of marriage has to mean something. It meant everything to me, I said honestly. That's why your betrayal cut so deep. 2 weeks after Carlos moved out, I was painting my kitchen lavender when my sister Maria called. Linda, you're the talk of the church auxiliary meeting. Betty told everyone about Carlos being your tenant for 25 years. Word was spreading exactly as I'd hoped. What's the general reaction? Shock, admiration, and a lot of women asking how to check their own property deeds. That afternoon, I received a call from Sarah Martinez. Linda, Bob and I feel terrible about your anniversary party. We should have said something when Carlos called you the maid. You looked uncomfortable. That was enough. We had no idea you actually owned the house. Carlos always acted like he made all the decisions. He made suggestions. I made the decisions. There's a difference. Saturday evening, the annual church potluck arrived. The same community gathering where Carlos and I had been fixtures for 20 years. I'd considered skipping, but decided it was time to face our social circle directly. I walked into Fellowship Hall, carrying my grandmother's famous peach cobbler recipe, the same dish I'd brought for decades. Conversations quieted as I entered, then resumed with obvious intensity. Bob Martinez approached first. Linda, we wanted to apologize again for not speaking up at your anniversary party. It's forgotten, Bob. Sarah joined us, her face flushed with embarrassment. We keep thinking about Carlos saying you didn't understand financial matters when you actually owned everything. Most assumptions about women's capabilities are wrong, I said simply. But how did he not know? Bob asked, genuinely baffled. 25 years of rental agreements? He never read what he signed, assumed that writing checks meant ownership. A small crowd was gathering now, the same people who'd witnessed Carlos's dismissive announcement about selling his house, who'd heard him call me the maid in front of everyone. Is it true he tried to sell your house with his girlfriend? Asked Carol from book club. He tried. The realtor was quite surprised to discover he had no legal standing. Nervous laughter rippled through the group. Tom Williams, Carlos's golf partner, looked uncomfortable. Where's Carlos living now? Studio apartment across town, adjusting to tenant life elsewhere. This is unbelievable, said Janet Foster, who'd known us since we were newlyweds. Carlos always bragged about his property investments and financial decisions. He was very confident, I agreed diplomatically. You must have been planning this for months, Sarah said admiringly. I was documenting behavior for months. The planning started when he publicly dismissed my intelligence at our anniversary celebration. The group fell silent, remembering that exact moment. We all heard him, Bob admitted quietly. None of us knew how to respond. You respond by remembering that women who organize households, manage paperwork, and pay attention to details usually know exactly what they own. Betty joined our circle, beaming. Linda's inspired 3 women to request their property deeds this week. Good, I said. Knowledge is power. Pastor Morrison approached with his wife. Linda, we're sorry about your divorce, but you seem remarkably at peace. I am, for the first time in years, completely at peace. As the evening wound down, I realized something profound had shifted. These same people who'd watched Carlos dismiss me publicly now saw me as someone who'd quietly maintained control all along. The woman they'd pitied at the anniversary party had become someone they respected, even admired. Driving home to my lavender kitchen in my grandmother's house, I felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she actually was. The community that had witnessed my humiliation had now witnessed my vindication. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, but tonight I was exactly where I belonged, in control of my own story. 6 weeks later, I stood in my newly painted lavender kitchen, reviewing the final divorce decree. Carlos had signed everything without contest, accepting that he had no claim to property he'd never actually owned. The transformation felt complete. Gone were the beige walls Carlos had insisted were sophisticated. Gone was the stark, minimalist furniture he'd preferred. My house finally looked like a home where I actually lived. My phone rang. Amelia, my daughter, calling from her new job in Atlanta. "Mom, I just got the pictures you sent of the house. It looks amazing. I can't believe how different everything feels." "Different how?" "It actually looks like you live there now, instead of just existing in someone else's space." That observation hit deeper than I'd expected. How long had I been existing in someone else's version of my own life? "How are you feeling about everything?" Amelia asked gently. "Free," I said honestly. For the first time in years, completely free. After we hung up, I walked through my house, really seeing it. The living room walls were now sage green. The dining room featured the antique china cabinet my grandmother had left me, which Carlos had always said was too old-fashioned for display. Every room told the story of a woman who'd finally stopped apologizing for her own preferences. My doorbell rang. Margaret Flynn stood on my porch with a bottle of champagne and a manila envelope. "Congratulations, Linda. It's official. The divorce is finalized, and the property settlement is complete. You retain full ownership of everything that was already yours." "Which was everything?" I said, laughing. "Exactly." Margaret came inside, looking around admiringly. "This place looks completely different. It feels different. Margaret, I can't thank you enough for helping me through this. You did the hard work. I just made sure the law recognized what was already true." We opened the champagne on my front porch as the sun set over my neighborhood. My neighborhood, in my house, on my property. "Any word on Carlos?" Margaret asked. "He's renting a studio apartment across town. Sophia never did come back. Apparently she's dating a real estate developer now." "And how do you feel about that?" I considered the question seriously. "I feel sorry for him. Not because he lost me, but because he spent 25 years married to someone he never bothered to actually know." "That's remarkably gracious." "I'm not being gracious, I'm being honest. Carlos fell in love with the idea of having a wife who made his life comfortable. He never fell in love with me." Margaret raised her glass. "To knowing the difference." As evening settled over my neighborhood, I felt the profound satisfaction of a woman who'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she actually was. My grandmother's house had become my sanctuary. Her wisdom had become my strength. Her warnings had become my salvation. In protecting what she'd left me, I'd discovered something far more valuable than property. I'd found myself. The woman who'd once defined herself as Carlos's wife had become something much more powerful. A woman who belonged entirely to herself. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new choices, new chances to live authentically. Tonight, I was exactly where I belonged. Home.